Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the Public's chicken tender sub of extreme metal podcasts. I am the death metal guy, aka that feeling when your wife confronts you regarding all the time you spend pondering your mystic orb.
And I am the black metal guy, aka lyrical themes, nature, darkness, introspection.
It's everything on the Atmospheric Black Metal channel. Nice.
Yes, yeah. Dude, I remembered the AKA thing I was trying to remember. I thought
Go for it.
I was going to do an orb one. I was going to do
you were
gonna,
one, and you were going to do an orb one too? I like how we were both going for the orb.
It's the hour of the orb.
Hour of the orb. So my period of meditation that my wife always confronts me about. Yeah, it's like
exactly. Yes.
Women don't understand the orb. I don't get it.
I don't know. I actually got me and my girlfriend a his and hers orb set. Hers is pink.
That's good. It's nice, so you can ponder together.
Does your girl always give you grief for pondering your orb?
It's the first time we've done like a deep Terminus Discord in-joke as our intro.
Pretty much, yes. I assume the orb memes must be coming from somewhere on the outside, but they're certainly popular on our Discord.
Oh, dude, pondering the orb. I mean, that is it's a very Terminus activity, to ponder your orb while listening
Absolutely.
to black metal.
Orbs out, lads. All right.
Orbs out. All right, we got a fucking show to do. Oh, Jesus. We should just finish it there. You got your orb talk for a couple minutes, boys. We're done. All right, so this show that we have to do. Okay, so. Quick off the top, or should I put it at the end of the little mini review at the front, the housekeeping stuff?
Yeah, why don't you? Yeah, that's a good idea, isn't it? It's like the YouTube video starts with the first 5 minutes, and then just as it gets interesting, it goes to the ad for Raid Shadow Legends. Yeah,
or for Manscape razors or some shit,
or gold replicas of Napoleon.
I wish there was more of that. Can we make YouTube ads a little bit more like late night TV ads circa 1997 with commemorative coins and shit?
No, they are now, but it's just all moved to the sort of, because the History Channel now just does reality shows. It's all been moved to these sort of DIY history channels.
Oh, okay. So you're watching Primitive Technology or something, and it's
or I've been watching. I don't know. There's some of them. There was one that did a really good series on Napoleon that I cannot remember, but there's also the Kings and Generals is pretty good, especially for the military stuff. Yeah.
All right, so we'll keep the housekeeping to the end of the segment. Yeah, it's just and we're about to get into our show, but first, be sure to smash that like button, etc., etc. Okay, so...
Oh, also, if you listen to us on Apple or something, leave a rating and perhaps even a review. I think a lot of people listen to us as a podcast rather than YouTube, and you're probably listening... There's a good chance you're listening on Apple Podcasts, but, yeah, you could help us boost our ratings there, and it would be dang.
It's actually...
Also, the one other thing would be, I should say, here's a classic YouTube whoring thing. We have 450 subscribers on YouTube. Can you help us get to 500 by the end of the year?
Oh man, that's old school Call of Duty commentary video shit. It's I'll release my next video if this gets 120 likes. Oh Jesus Christ! Everything old is new again. Okay, so our little block up front, little mini review. So last week we covered the debut record by Mondo Cane, black metal from Sweden. And this time, guy hit me up on Facebook, and I directed him to our email. Yeah, any of you guys, if you want to hit me up and talk about music, you want to submit something, please just send it directly to the email. I'm going to ask you to do that anyway if you hit me on Facebook. So, this is a guy from a project called Journey into Darkness. The individual behind this project was in a sort of a doom death band from the early 90s called Sorrow. It's like kind of deep cut, like earlier Roadrunner stuff. That was probably, that was probably when they were called Road Racer Records. But Sorrow's Hatred and Disgust is actually a pretty cool record from back then. And apparently he's got a band that he's been doing for a while now called Journey into Darkness. This is the third full-length. I guess he released his first one back in 96, and then it laid dormant for a while and came back in 2020. So this is the third record called Infinite Universe, Infinite Death. So basically what goes on here is this is a symphonic black death project, heavier on the black metal, but you can see where the death metal creeps in along the edges. And this is very trenchcoat era in a lot of ways. This is rooted right in the like early to mid 2000s, albeit with, better production and kind of streamlined songwriting ideas from nowadays. So I gave this one a listen earlier today, and I was just really surprised by kind of the authentic relationship to that old sound. And really what this sounds like at the end of the day. I've seen some other reviews, people are talking about this, it's kind of like a stripped down Emperor or something like that. No, what it really sounds like is Limbonic Art. Limbonic Art, but maybe a little bit less like dancing on the keyboard,
Limbonic Art was really keyboardy.
Yeah, extremely keyboardy. I was giving them a listen before you came on just to make sure that I wasn't off base, because I haven't listened to a full Limbonic Art album in, 8 years or something. But yeah, very keyboardy. And this is also very keyboardy, very symphonic instrument forward. But I wouldn't say that it's like the dominant melodic voice. In the production, it's definitely the dominant sound, but ultimately it's more of a mixture between that and the guitars. Musically, this is really simple. I mean, the arrangements are kind of elaborate. There's a lot of different instrumental voices, but as far as just like riffing ideas and melodic ideas, these are all very straightforward concepts from like 98 black metal, but kind of gussied up with some of the ideas from the 2000s. It sounds like resolutely old school, which I found pretty interesting. You get past the kind of sheen and like the modern polished production, and you have something that wouldn't be completely out of place back in like 2003, 2004. So real quick, I'll just show you a quick sample. We can talk about it because you haven't listened to this one. We're kind of going back and forth doing like show it blind to the other guy sort of thing. So let's listen to Infinite Disillusion, the second track on the record. And there's a pretty interesting little breakdown and rearrangement sequence on this that I want to highlight. So, one thing that I find interesting about this, which is pretty authentic to, like, symphonic black stuff from that era, which you don't hear now, is that nowadays, if a band is symphonic, the emphasis is on using the symphonic arrangements as, like, a leading melodic idea. Like, everything is kind of a supporting cast to that. Like, if you're listening to something that, like, kids nowadays listen to, like Flesh God Apocalypse, that's what it's about. It's about these bombastic orchestral arrangements with kind of an extreme metal underpinning. Here, the symphonic stuff is used as kind of a blunt instrument. For the most part, it's just doubling up and doing, like, octave harmonies with the riffs underneath. So you get this interesting, kind of authentically early 2000s just wall of sound effect where it's like, how do I make this single, very simple elemental riff really, really big by stacking a bunch of instrumental voices on it, you know?
Yeah, that's certainly what stuck out to me. I mean, I think sometimes octave harmonization can sound really heavy. I was listening to a band from Texas called Voton with a V, but that writes about like Aztec or Mayan stuff. They had some kind of cool trench coat era octavey stuff. Here, I feel like the keys and guitars are interfering with each other.
You think so?
There's something on. There's that basic simple. I mean, first of all, right, you've got to really sell a harmonic idea like that. Like, it's like if the whole thing is actually based on a single melodic line, right, the riffs have to be sick. In this case, the riffs are kind of standard. What could deliver it might be some cool rhythmic stuff in the playing. But in that dimension, I feel like the guitars are timed to the kinds of rhythms you can get with the whatever kind of attack he's got on the keyboard pattern. So you get this kind of herky-jerky thing. Bum, 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 bum. Or when the guitars dropped out at the beginning and the keys came in, right? You could hear this boop, 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 boop. I mean, just diminishing the attack on the keys or something like that, making them smoother and more ethereal, and decoupling the guitar, the rhythmic playing in the guitar from that might go a long way towards giving this more sort of, I don't know, more heaviosity.
Well, I think you probably see that. I imagine that this music is probably... I have a feeling that it starts on the keyboard, and then the guitars are wrapped around that. I think it begins with these kind of simple, kind of Wagnerian classical stems, and then riffs are written underneath that, and perhaps that should be flipped around. But the second sample I have shows kind of a more dynamic side of the band. Cool. So this is going to be off The Briefest Moment, and here's where this whole kind of like 2000s quote-unquote symphonic extreme metal idea kind of comes together a little bit more. You've got some more rhythmic variation. It feels a little bit more dynamic. It's still simple, elemental, part of the style of this band, but I think this second sample is really maybe the direction that he should move in.
Well, that was a lot more sophisticated.
I was about to say, listening to that again, I was like, well, that feels like it answers most of the questions you had regarding that first sample.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely still some weird herky-jerky timing on the synths. The sort of like, beta, just making the synths swell more would be good. But because he wants them to double the guitar, he's trying to get them to come in fast. And I think it's just the problem of, like, how do you play pizzicato strings on a keyboard?
Well, yeah, and it's entirely possible that the synths are just, like, programmed synth patches, too.
No, I mean, it seems like they are, and so then it's like, maybe he should mess around with the patches a bit. But, other than that, like, partly it works better because he does more sustain on the keyboards. And he sort of frees the keyboards from the rhythm guitars, even in sort of like little ways. The keys are doing smoother stuff, and there they sound good when they're holding smoother notes. And just, there was some interesting rhythmic stuff where it just kind of seesawed down, and then without any cue that we're changing riffs, just sort of kept some of that rhythm, but jerked us into a new part. I don't know, it was pretty cool.
Yeah, throughout the whole record, he's playing around a lot with this, like, 4/4 against, like, 3/4 waltz time stuff, which I guess may be, like, a signature of his. I mean, that was kind of a thing that Limbonic Art would play around with, and, you know, some of the synth black bands from the 2000s.
Would Arcturus do that?
Oh, possibly, but who's ever listened to a whole Arcturus album? Come on.
Well, I mean, I certainly haven't, but possibly.
I mean, I used to have long hair. I'm not that long hair, though.
Yeah, I think I clicked on the Bandcamp once and was like, "What the fuck is this?" and indexed it as something sounding like spoopy space waltz. So.
No, like the first couple Arcturus records that are more like actual black metal are pretty good, but then they got into full prog territory, and it definitely lost me there. But
dressing up as like dwarves,
space dwarves,
piloted. I don't know. Yeah, piloted dirigible through space.
No, I think there is something here. I mean, we've been talking so much on the show just in the past few months about the idea of these kind of like 2000s variants on styles coming back. And I mean, I'm not going to say that like I was sitting here craving 2000 symphonic black metal, but when it's presented to me, I mean, one, there's definitely a nostalgia kick because I was listening to shit like this all the time when I was younger. But also it's like, oh, okay, so maybe keyboards don't just have to be like, ooh, fucking tinkly fairy melodies, and this is the black metal band that's about a unicorn and stuff. Now it's like, ooh, maybe they can be like bombastic and like elitist space vampire shit. And I'm like, okay, I can get into that.
Hail! This is Brandon from Cromlech, and you're listening to Terminus.
Alright, we're back, and this time we were listening to But Wait! You fuckers skipped ahead to get to the review. But no, we put the housekeeping at the beginning of the first main section this time. We're tricky. It's gonna keep popping up at random times. Halfway through reviews, in the middle of an interlude track, you never know. You know, it's...
in the middle of my sentence.
Yeah, just cut you off, and then it's like, oh, by the way, Facebook. Alright, so before we get into the main show, social media. Facebook, The Death Metal Guy, at Terminus Podcast. Instagram, The Black Metal Guy, at Terminus Extreme Metal. And for your true support, Patreon or Subscribestar. $3 and up, Terminus Prime. $5 and up, Discord, where you get to ponder your orb with other orb enthusiasts. $10 and up, voting privileges to determine what the nature of your bonus episode that month will be. Black Metal Guy, let us continue. What orb do you have for us to ponder today?
Well, Death Metal Guy, I was gazing in my orb and it showed me an upcoming release by a band called Plebeian Grandstand, whose name I have heard sort of being thrown around for, well, kind of a decade, I guess. We know some guys who were listening to them back in the day. I've only ever had the vaguest idea of what this music is. I believe they're sort of on the cited as, you know, people compare Serpent Column to them. I think it's supposed to be sort of math mathcore stuff, modern hardcore derived stuff that has a lot of black metal in it, or something. Right, something with some relation to the ortho disso school we've been talking about. I still have not gone back and checked out their old albums, but this is a band that has been important to a lot of people, and I figured, okay, well, they got a new one, let's check it out. So this is Rien ne suffit, which I think is probably like nothing. It's either nothing is enough or nothing is not enough. You want to Google Translate that for me while I'm talking?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Sometimes they double negative. And this is out on Debemur Morti Productions. So that means despite the sort of hardcore derivation, right, this is out on a prominent French black metal label, which just goes to show that the most sort of the heavy or crushing orthodox aspect of French black metal, French heavy urban black metal from France, has always been closely joined with the hardcore scene. Things you could compare this to generally, very generally, would be stuff like Celeste or Throane, Throane. Throane occasionally makes sounds that sounds like buildings are falling down, or very often, and this record is definitely going for the buildings falling down approach. And, generally this sort of, but you even get the hardcore underbelly on stuff like Aesoth or whatever. So this is coming out of that tradition, and, DSO, which has their crypto screamo thing and all that. So you get an idea of the general neighborhood. And point being, these guys have been doing this stuff since 2010, and really first EP in 2007. So I'd sort of be interested to see how the older records sound. But as for this is a very obvious bid for like most extreme thing to come out this year, right? I mean, it is an attempt to carry this dissonant, clanging, orthodox BM derived sound to its logical conclusion, at the same time integrate it with aggressive avant-garde electronic music. And so in terms of the territory it's aiming for, sort of just apocalyptic meltdown via the best of both worlds. It's kind of shooting for the same territory as Humanity's Last Breath.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so what's your overall impression of this?
Oh, this is what retarded people think Serpent Column sounds like.
That's certainly true.
Okay, so it's what retarded people think Serpent Column sounds like. It's really not that extreme. It's very loud. It's very dissonant. But this is a record here to shock people that don't listen to extreme music.
Yes.
I think that's it. Well, first of all, let's make it clear, it's not a metal record, not in any meaningful way. It's a skronky hardcore record that is not even as extreme as other skronky hardcore records we've talked about. This is fundamentally less extreme than Sectioned, for instance.
By far.
This is less extreme than albums we've covered this year, and it's treading in
probably
very...
It's probably less extreme than any of the wild stuff Serpent Column has done.
Yeah, it's like it's got very clippy production, and it's very technical. Sometimes the drumming is very technical. The guitar stuff is not as technical as it sounds. This is one of the first albums we've ever covered on the show where the guitar work and the riffing is absolutely the least interesting part of it. What I will say to its credit, there is a pretty neat electronic group hiding within this hardcore band.
I'm not sure I even agree with that. But let's get into it.
Let's fucking get into it.
Right, so Yeah, people have been requesting that we do more just full-on critical reviews, and people have been requesting that we cover some of the more relevant stuff just because they want to know what we hear, want to say about it, what have to say about it. So here we are. Here we go. This is the first track, Mass Critique. So first off, let's give you an idea of before I go into the sample, idea of what this record's about. This record has a big press release. It wants to tell you what it's about. This record, right, the quote that begins the press release is, "The fall is near. What to follow?" Well, I mean, good fucking question. And anybody listening to extreme music today, in any serious way, would probably agree it's a question they've posed. Here's how it embellishes on that. On fourth full length, Rien, suffit, nothing is enough. Okay, there we go. Sui generis synthesis, Plebeian Grandstand, take a violent wrecking ball to the edifice of extreme music. Remolding the... Yeah, I know.
Just go on. I'm going to be groaning the whole time.
Remolding the pieces as a mirror portal into psychological, societal, and global turmoil. Always unpredictable and extraordinary, the band... Okay, blah, blah, blah. So this is... So, like, the idea is they're going for a sort of horrifying social realism, right? And fair enough, right? Because, there's all sorts of... No matter where you're coming from on it, right? Everyone says they can't wait for the collapse and blah, blah, blah. But, lest you forget how the footage from Bosnia or Rwanda looked. Or, if you're lucky, maybe you draw the long straw and you get Northern Ireland for 50 years. Right, you get the Troubles. Very deeply unpleasant stuff that people who've grown up sheltered in the West can have no imagination of. So maybe there's something to that. We're making a really ugly record that captures that without the sort of glorifying aspect that so many other albums do. So let's see how they do this.
Yeah, I've heard Conate.
Is that what the vocals in Conate sound like?
Yeah, basically. This basically sounds like this is like sped up Conate, basically. But nobody remembers what Conate sounds like, so if you do it again, it's like it's really special.
Mm-hmm. It's so in terms of like so whether it's original or not is that is a fair question, because this record is basically we've kind of like hidden the elephant in the room as far as how this record is written. We should have said up front, like, it basically puts the guitars, not only are the guitars the least interesting part, but it mostly is written as a kind of electronic album, with the drums and guitars doing things that are supposed to work texturally. Right? So there's the sample you've just heard, although it is the classic French Orthodox clanging intro, it really sounds like that for the rest of the record. In general. So the record is really swinging for like a certain kind of abstraction and extremity and originality, right? So in terms of originality, okay, we can cross that off. Extremity, well, yeah, I think opening your record with someone who sounds like he's in desperate pain, like he's just watched family members get mass executed or something, right? Or lost a body part. Yeah, that's pretty extreme. It's definitely not like, it's jarring. It's not like the kinds of anguish we're familiar. Oh, the harsh vocals express an emotion of anguish. But the kind of emotions the kind of emotions of anguish that we are used to the harsh vocals expressing are usually things like, right, sort of DSBM stuff, or, your Varg and, you stepped outside and remembered its modernity, or some, this kind of anguish, right? Here, this is a much more kind of, in some ways more uncomfortable for a spectator, especially if you're taking the conceit of the record seriously. And it's an impressive performance. It probably hurt his voice to do that. Unfortunately, this is easily the most extreme moment on the record.
Yeah. You will continue to hear variations of this, but with a blast beat under it, and some tremolo riffs under it.
And without the kind of modern Greek tragedy vocal performance. And basically, does the album keep sounding this apocalyptic? Yeah, but only in the sense that it replicates what periods of just, social collapse and sort of mass violence sound like, which is, the proverbial long periods of boredom punctuated by sheer terror, right? But without the terror.
Yeah, mostly without the terror, which is like the operative problem. I mean, I guess honestly, man, my whole thing about this is that there's something about this record. I think that probably mutually the reason, going. Well, like kind of like I said up front, this feels like it is. This isn't actually. This is secretly not for people into extreme music, like at all. This is the most extreme record that like a record collector nerd has.
Well, that's what I was. So yes. So here's the thing. Although I have the flip side to that. This goes together, though. Anyone who is used to listening to this sound palette, like, right, that is the only moment, what we just played you is the only moment on the record that's going to sound remotely jarring to anyone who has listened to Paracletus, listened to earlier Ulcerate, listened to, I don't know, like fucking Jane Doe, or like Ad Nauseum from this year, any of the newer Disso stuff, right? Any of these bands, Orthodox cavern type bands we've covered on the show. If you've heard that stuff, or you've heard modern beatdown, like none of this is, or you're one of those crazy fucks who just listens to like real power electronics or harsh noise, like my co-host. This isn't going to faze you at all, and so like if you're a person who listens to extreme music seeking extremity, it won't do it. It's just going to be a continuum of sounds that isolated might be unpleasant. And in a sort of like, why am I listening to this way, rather than a sort of like, my mind is being peeled off way. And on the other hand, yeah, there's the other kind of listener you're describing is also very inured to extremity, right? The Rate Your Music kind of avant.
Dude, I was about to say, this is going to be top 10 metal records on Rate Your Music, no question, for this year.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these kinds of people who are sort of follow this invisible, this alternate universe of metal that we generally try not to cover, right? And sort of keep track of metal from the outside. I think the current fashionable word is spectators, which is a pretty good one.
I prefer the old school tourists. You know?
Oh, sorry, that was the word. Yeah, tourists, yeah. Tourists are window shoppers, but like, these sorts of people listen to a lot of really extreme music. You know, they really do, right? If you look down the similar artists list, we got Plebeian Grandstand, we get, it's part of this, it's got its own canon, right? Deathspell Omega, Dodecahedron, Serpent Column is the number 3 sound alike. Maybe it's
these are the similar stuff. Artists on Metal Archives.
Imperial Triumphant, Ulcerate, Piron, Gorguts, Bloodhouse Nord, right?
It really sounds like Secret. None of these, of course.
Right. The Secret, who suck. Hexis, who are good. Jutgeite, who sucks. Celeste, who are good. Anyway, it keeps going. But point is, like, if you're into this stuff, the people who follow this sort of thing are very inured to extremity, and it's in part because they choose bands where all the noise flows by them.
Yeah, and that's one of the problems.
It's actually easier to listen to a record of really continuous, harsh, noisy, dissonant textures than it is to listen to a record like, as you were going to say, that sectioned, right, where the riffing suggests immediate physical violence.
Yeah. I mean, it is. Let me get to a sample, because we could just like be fucking angry the whole time, but let me pretend to wrap a review around this. Alright, so the black metal parts of this suck. This is not a black metal band in any meaningful way. I don't even know why this is really considered part of the metal scene, apart from the fact that like weird skronky hardcore has like infiltrated black metal to such a degree that they're considered like basically sister genres at this point, which is bizarre because the like energizing impulse behind each is radically different. So let's listen to one of the metal songs. This is a later place on the album. So this is Rien ni Fate. This is kind of the closest, at least for me, that the more metallic stuff on this record kind of landed. And it's really because of its proximity to the stuff that's much more interesting, which are kind of like the noise textures, the electronic stuff, yada, yada, yada. So what you're going to hear in abrupt succession is like mediocre black metal part, cool noise part, mediocre black metal part, cool hardcore part, etc. Leading me to my
oh shit, that's like all my favorite bands.
Well, minus the mediocre part. So I'll listen to this, and it's like, dude, it's so clear. It's like binary notation. It's like 1 0 1 0. It's like good bad. All right, so let's listen to this one. right, so I like the distorted analog synths that sound like a distorted elephant trumpet. That's cool.
That's the other highlight of the record.
Yeah, that's neat. I like some of the more hardcore-y rhythmic stuff going on. But the black metal riffs suck. They're not real riffs. Have we run out of spooky orthodox arpeggios yet? Like, is it even possible to fucking write one anymore that hasn't been done before?
Well, I was just thinking, if you're really into this shit, I mean, the people who are really into this shit are not listening to riffs, right? But, like, if they're listening to production and vague texture, but, if you were really into this shit and took it really earnestly and listened to the riff, we're getting to a stage where it's developing its own standard vocabulary. So, like, you could go, just like we'll listen through something and be like, oh, yeah, that's like a cool variant on a Satanic War Master riff, but they turn it around a bit at the end, more like, who knows, like Emperor, right? You know, all the shit we do on this show, basically. You could... If you were really into disso stuff, you could start to identify things like that. So, like, at the end, it was like, I started to hear, like, there's the riff, where you sort of, like, you sort of trem in a kind of nebulous way, and then you feather up the arpeggio and hit this kind of major key thing. I mean, that Azothist record had an entire song built on, I think, that exact idea.
Yeah.
It's like getting its own standard riffs. The problem is they all suck.
Yeah, they all suck. And also, we literally heard, and we heard the Ad Nauseum record earlier this year, which is an album basically built out of those riffs, and all of them are better than everything on this album.
Oh yeah, I mean, to be sure, yeah, we have given. There are things in this tradition that we have given better reviews than this. I think at this point, listening to this brings out everything we find frustrating about the worst versions of it.
It's like there's plenty of we've covered a lot of like really dissonant stuff this year. It's just like I think we have compelling reasons for why all of it's categorically better than this. This has this like a baiting quality to it where it's just like I don't know, this is such a frustrating record. Like, so intensely. And before people can, like, address it in the comments, yeah, of course, it's, like, internecine scenester warfare shit. Yeah, okay, congratulations.
That's not really it, though, because, like, I like Celeste, I like Hexis. Those are very black. This is the ultimate clean black t-shirt band, right? But those are very clean black t-shirt, French hardcore black metal kind of things. I think Hexis is from Belgium or something, but they're same deal. Those are good bands, like good. Like I talk about liking Celeste on this show. Like, I mean, they're not quite seen as black metal bands in the same way. It's weird that Plebeian have this cred within the metal scene, that's for sure, or are seen as metal.
I mean, but I think
Celeste are kind of seen as a black metal band, or were back in the day, and have way more to do with it than this does, because Celeste is kind of relentless monochrome riffs.
But it's like Plebeian Grandstand are only considered part of the metal scene because of like record collector nerds on Rate Your Music and like the coolest guy at Decibel shoving this kind of shit down our throats. You know, that's
well. So yes, okay. So there's some interesting politics to it. The other thing is just, I mean, I gotta say it again. You know, the classic. I think the Hessian Firm guys have talked about the kazoo test, which is not a phrase I'd heard, or is I think a phrase I'd heard back in the day but forgotten. But it's really just the idea that like music with certain. I'm open to more exceptions to this rule now in certain cases, but generally speaking, musical ideas, unless you're like making them with pedals or on a computer, musical ideas should sound cool if you're playing them on acoustic guitar or on a fucking kazoo.
Yeah.
And it's in part because power comes from melody and rhythm before anything else. It comes from the elemental form of the thing. And this is all in texture manipulation.
Yeah.
it comes from melody, rhythm, harmony. That's what makes metal powerful and scary. It's not all the noisy stuff, it's the riffs. If you played De Mysteris Dom Satanas on a verbed out, like, acoustic guitar, it would be terrifying, and in fact,
yeah, it'd still be scary as fuck.
In fact,
yeah.
I mean, in fact, you know, that approach to guitar production is on Following the Voice of Blood, basically, right? I mean, that's kind of like, I mean, you know, people have done that, essentially. Or, you know, the other thing is, like, Iron Maiden played on tinny laptop speakers is still very heavy because it's Iron Maiden.
Yeah, yeah. It's like, I mean, this is the terrible consequence of Anthony Fantano becoming the world's most important music critic.
Are you saying that are you saying that the low end production is sort of is really just massive and heavy and murky and just
it's massive and heavy and abrasive, you know, it really gives you that feeling of, you know, darkness and intensity and shit. What the fuck? How many times have we done that on this show now?
I think we're literally quoting, for our listeners, if you're curious, I think we're literally quoting his review of a Zabalba record, probably Hasta La Muerte.
yeah. That was,
or Tierra y Libertad or something, one of those two, I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the one concession that I'm going to give to this record. I think, maybe unlike you, that there's a pretty cool electronic project lurking within. Because there's a couple tracks that are straight electronic on this. And I think those are the highlights of the record. I think that if they created a record of just this kind of material, I would actually listen to it and enjoy it a lot. So let's go to a track called Trapisme. It's like just under 3 minutes. We'll listen to the whole thing. And for me, the salient question, you know, while you're listening to it is, clearly their heart is in this. This is where the band resides mentally. So why are we wrapping a crappy orthodox black metal record around it? Okay, so honestly, that I can get behind. You know, I like the I like the kind of like power electronic style textures. I like the kind of breakbeat style drumming. The harsh vocals are pretty cool. All that put together, that sounds neat to me. I'd listen to a half-hour record of shit that sounds like that. So why do I have to listen to 40 minutes of blast beats and like spooky orthodox arpeggios to get to that?
Yeah, that is definitely one of the better parts on the record. I'll give you that. Yeah, the vocals that's one of the few places where the vocals approach the extremity of the beginning of the record. There, you know, he sounds pretty frenzied there, but and you know, this sort of double time mecha blasts, which I think are being played by a real drummer, but clearly are simulating a drum machine. It's that's all. Yeah, that's all pretty good. And I like the note of tonality at the end. Like one of the things that's closest to a riff. And yes, I know you can write really dissonant, crazy riffs, of course. But like one of the things that's closest to a something with some definition and power to it on this record is just the dubstep bass line at the end. You know, you get that falling bass line. It's like tonal color and sort of a defined thing that one can engage with.
That's the thing. Is like an album of wall-to-wall chaos, or it's not even chaotic, but you know what I mean. The affect of chaos has no power. Like it has no real energy behind it because there's no contours or definition to it. I mean, you get something like power electronics, it kind of gets away with it because it has like usually like a vocal line guiding it, providing these kind of signposts to create structure and to make everything very heavy. For the most part, this record just circles around itself. It's just like, spooky arpeggios, blast beats. None of that's extreme anymore. I mean, the most extreme moments are the electronic ones.
Well, this is a classic punk scene issue, which is its reactive definition of power. Punk thinks of power as exercised against. That's the only way it can legitimate power. And thinks of it as sort of rebellious, deconstructive, breaking down, and it associates it with chaos, demolition of form, or something, right? For it's like punk is power is like things falling apart and being blown open and shit. The problem is simply that that's not how it works. And if you want a good example, listen to Hear Nothing, See Nothing, Say Nothing, or Why, which are based on sort of monolithic clarity of form. And you know, listen to something like Crass, which really does sound very punk and has the same kind of unpleasant wall of sound quality that this record has, right? Sort of inner clattering, right? Successfully sounds like it's demolishing boundaries and, scrambling categories and whatever. And it's like, sounds like a fucking mess. And so this record it has that kind of misconception about power that animates a lot of punk stuff. And which is like the opposite of what you'd get on, say, an Iron Maiden record. Which is just Iron Maiden is almost like laughing. I just almost imagine it like Eddie laughing or something, right? This music is just, Iron Maiden is from the perspective of music like this, Iron Maiden is the most naive, tinkly, childish sort of music, but Iron Maiden's a lot heavier. So let's go to, I don't even think we need to go to my sample. I mean, there's a part Maudit is also a good part. I think there's a place where, in fairness, given how negative we're being, let's go and do diligence. But I really just want to get back to the stuff we're already talking about. so basically what I wanted to highlight there was just what you described with more knowledge of how this works than me as an analog synth making a screaming apocalyptic elephant noise, right?
Yeah, that's cool. And the continuous gravity blast is cool. I like that.
Yeah, no, the drumming, I think one thing we can all agree on is the drumming is good. The sort of, the guitar, that's one of the only places the guitar works in any real way there. And it's because it's playing the rhythm part to the elephant, right? Mm-hmm. Or to the air, I think the other thing the key is they're supposed to sound like is an air raid siren. And in some ways, I think this record is in dialogue with Hear Nothing, See Nothing, Say Nothing, which is kind of a record that's about the horrors of apocalypse and nuclear war, but kind of ends up making them just sound cool. Whereas this record is trying to do sort of the opposite. But you get a similar idea.
This is trying to insist how uncool it really is.
Yes, and there could be an artistic point to be made there, but it ain't being made here. The sort of the trumpeting thing or the air raid siren, it's cool because it's like Discharge has samples of things like that, right? But here they're being used as, it's like, okay, let's manipulate, or the air raid siren that every war metal band samples at the beginning of the record, right? Mm-hmm. Let's take that and turn it into a melodic line and manipulate it. Okay, there you're working with form in a powerful way. There you are, and you're doing so in a way that's specific to electronics, right? You're manipulating pure sound in a way you can't on a guitar. It sounds really cool and really heavy. And although you're not really, it's like moving through semitones and stuff. It's playing a melody, right? That's like you're riffing with an air raid siren. That's cool. Yeah, so about the electronic stuff, I guess I agree with you that it's the strongest thing here, and that those are the parts we both like the best. Mm-hmm. But in terms of innovation, or whatever, which is clearly one of the claims here, or groundbreaking extremity, all of the electronic stuff on this record dates back to pretty much exactly the same time as the main reference points in the guitar work. Mm-hmm. I think what does it sound like, right? It sounds like, Empty Set, right?
Yeah.
Empty Set, or any of the, it sounds like a bunch of breakcore shit that I can't remember, that you would probably know better than me. But, right, there's a whole genre called, if you want stuff that sounds like the best electronic parts on this, with the sort of screaming and the grinding blasts and the sort of shrieking harsh noise, there's a whole genre called breakcore that just sounds like that.
You can even listen to one that has that drumming but samples Slayer riffs. It's called drumcore. They're really good. And it's heavier than this.
You could even listen to Sectioned, which plays breakcore with guitars, right?
Yeah.
And has really good electronic work in it. I mean, but as far the electronic ideas basically are, sure, I guess the last time there was a quantum leap in extreme electronics, unless I've been missing some new shit, right? Which I probably have. But there was a quantum leap in electronic extremity around 2010, 2012, 2013. Dark techno stuff, Ancient Methods, Regis, and also just all these responses to dubstep, just various kinds of super crushing, aggressive responses to dubstep, like Empty Set. And at the same time, that's right when the modern orthodox guitar style that now gets called avant-garde black metal or whatever was actually avant-garde, right? Was being codified, right? That's around the time of Paracletus. It's around the time of, Ulcerate was kind of peaking, right? All this stuff was sort of, Aesoth was about to put out Arrow and Heart, right around that time. So, to me it seems like they've just taken, this is supposed to be groundbreaking. All they've done is they've taken the last 10 years of extreme metal and electronica, carried it to a logical conclusion that we already knew was there. And to me this record feels like someone explaining a joke.
Alright, and we are back with what else can happen when you bring hardcore into extreme metal. So I guess to introduce this, I will admit to my character flaw here. So, this show... God, where do I begin? Damn. So we've been doing this show for about a year and a half, and we've had this kind of, like, odd love-hate relationship with Maggot Stomp. We covered some old fluids on Maggot Stomp. We covered that in Coffinized EP. Maybe something else. But yeah, just in the time since we started the show, Maggot Stomp has become such a household name, and I've run into so many people in my local scene that are just obsessed with everything that label puts out. I fell back on my underground scene kid laurels and was like, well, I guess I'm fucking done with Maggot Stomp. So, the record we're covering is the debut full-length by 200 Stab Wounds titled Slave to the Scalpel. And I went into this expecting to be too cool for it. Expecting to just be like, oh, well, it's Maggot Stomp. It's more punk kids playing death metal. I mean, it's alright for what it is, but, you know. And I have to eat my words because this is an excellent death metal record. Just full stop, no qualifiers. This is a really great death metal album. 200 Stab Wounds, for those who aren't familiar, like I said, they're one of the classics of the Maggot Stomp roster, along with, I guess, a lot of bands that have moved on to different labels now, like Fluids and Sanguisugabog.
What about the Ice band?
Frozen Soul? Were they on Maggot Stomp?
I think they were.
Jesus Christ.
If they're not, they're Maggot Stomp adjacent.
I think they're Maggot Stomp adjacent. Oh, no, their first demo was on Maggot Stomp.
I knew it.
Yeah, so Century Media has now scooped Frozen Soul and Sanguisugabog, and then Hell's Headbangers scoops Fluid. So it's like, who's left on the fucking roster? Well, I guess 200 Stab Wounds has to carry him into the future. And if that's the case, then Maggot Stomp can still be very healthy, because this is... I gotta say, I am so impressed by this album. So, this is one of the flagship bands of Maggot Stomp. I'm dimly familiar with some of their stuff, but I don't think I ever really gave it a chance. But, you know, I sat down and listened to this record, and what I got was, I guess for the first time I'll say on this show, full spectrum death metal, in the same way that we talk about full spectrum black metal. When we use that about black metal, we mean... like black metal was back in the second wave. It incorporated everything around it. It was not specifically raw or melodic. It was not specifically punky or more heavy metal. It gathered up all of those ideas and presented it in a complete package. And that's really what 200 Stab Wounds does here. These guys are reaching into so many different dimensions of death metal. We've got a lot of very traditional old school death metal on here. We've got brutal and slam death, and then we've got a lot of modern kind of hardcore meets death metal as well. And the result is something that sounds surprisingly unique, really well-rounded, but not with the edges sanded off. And it's almost a cliche to say that a band like this is heavier than, their brutal death contemporaries. But in a lot of cases, it's kind of true here. These guys are excellent songwriters. And I don't know what to say. I was just super surprised by just how excellent this record is. So, I mean, Black Metal Guy, what do you think of this one?
Yeah, I think it's really good. I definitely think it's sort of how I wish more kinds of death metal would sound these days. So this also sort of gave me, actually, I'm gonna save my sort of idea, which I know is slightly off target, but I'm gonna save that for after my sample. Would you mind if I just did the sample?
Oh yeah, and I'd like to say that the two tracks that you sampled were two tracks that I was considering sampling. So we're definitely of exactly the same mind of what the best tracks on this record are.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Also, it's just I think I was actually going to sample maybe one of the ones you did. So let us listen to my real creative sampling. I know the first track, but this is a minute and 25 seconds in, and it's going to start us off with something you might expect, a kind of sawing two-note brutal death metal blast, which I'm guessing is kind of a Mortician thing. And then it's gonna death. Okay, so that's Slayer.
Oh yeah.
So that was the thing that really surprised me, right? We got that Mortician blast, and then we got that kind of like retarded skank thing where they keep the riff going. It's like, okay, that kind of makes sense. Sped up two-step thing. And then you just get this just really confident, crisp right-hand stuff. Just like, I'm going to do two triplet sort of trills and then just like thrash out the root note on the end. And it's like, whoa, that's a Slayer riff. That's Slayer. And you get that kind of like just tempo pushing two-step stuff. And then they break it down further and you get, which is the rhythm of every Slayer-influenced metalcore band ever. And I'm using that term advisedly to refer to what it meant before, At the Gates clones, right? To mean specifically, right, there was this whole tendency in 90s hardcore and early 2000s hardcore where you could call Slayercore, just like, okay, that's the starting point for aggressive, for hardcore now, and you get like Integrity or All Out War, and later, sort of in that vein, of course, you get stuff like Hatebreed or whatever, but and a whole bunch of really cool European bands that I just don't know well enough. I mean, even the early Heaven Shall Burn stuff is kind of in that vein, like sort of Slayery, crushing hardcore with blast beats and sometimes death growls, but yeah, so you just get that, and the work with the palm mutes, just the right hand stuff is insane, right? Then they just do that sort of like they sink into that groove and the solo starts, and for any other band that could be like hitting the suck pedal. Right, yeah. And instead they keep the intensity in the right hand, and it's kind of like Criminally Insane, right? Yeah. Criminally Insane, yeah. Where there's this sort of ride cymbal thing or whatever, and the soloing is really good. So I don't know, that's just really good. But I was struck by, I think you're right that I can hear things that synthesize brutal death metal and some brutal death metal and like old school death and more sort of modern beatdown and slam influence stuff. There's a remarkable amount of Slayer influence on here.
Yeah. I think there's an omnipresent kind of thrash and thrash meets hardcore influence across this, which is fascinating. which is also interesting because this is not in any way death thrash.
No.
You know, this is a purely death metal record. This is one of the few records we've ever covered on the show that I would just call death metal. No qualifiers. You know, it is a death metal record. But you've written some really interesting stuff. You've got a very cool thesis about this record and the stuff. No, it's very smart, and I think we're going to have a lot of good kind of discussion about it. So, what do you think?
You want me to hit the bong now or on Slave to the Scalpel? Because we can also do it later when I get to yours.
Well, I want you to hit the bong now because I've got a sample from a different band that I'd like to play to
that's right.
Relate to what you want to talk about.
Yeah, so in terms of positioning this, right? So obviously this sounds, on the one hand, it synthesizes all this stuff. On the other hand, it sounds kind of like nothing else around today, right? So the Slayer thing is just so intense there, down to the note choice. And, so, right, at this point, right, if you're really into death metal or black metal, you're probably familiar with the idea of thinking of Slayer as a death metal band, right? Just not really having anything to do with the other quote-unquote big four, right? This band seems to think, their hypothesis seems to be that what death metal is building on Slayer. And that's as quite distinct to different starting points that you could pick, and much more popular starting points you could pick for death metal. So, like, you could do your, if you're in your character selection screen for your death metal band, right? It's like, you could be like the early death and possessed guy, or you can be like the entombed guy, and you get a heavy debuff to intelligence. Or you could be the incantation guy, right? And you get a debuff to, like, vitality. Or, suffocation, right? All this is, right? Those are some common starting points for all contemporary death metal bands. Mm-hmm. And all of those are influenced by Slayer. I mean, God, right? You can go through Entombed and find the Slayer riff, right? But But they're different, and Death and Possessed were kind of in parallel to Slayer, really. But it's a very different way of starting death metal, and that hypothesis that what's really important to Slayer is what allows them to find a common thread through these styles that we often think of as really different, right? Mm-hmm. Old school death metal, modern brutal death, and modern sort of, or modern and early 2000s brutal death, right? And sort of modern, let's say, avant pit music, right? Mm-hmm. Or modern beatdown slam, right? And so the Slayer gives you a through line through all those, because as we've talked about on the show, I think because I don't know anything about modern death metal, I bring this up a lot when we review tech death or brutal death, the weird kind of crypto thrash aspect a lot of those bands have. Mm-hmm. Even just in the way that the default riff for some of the most abstract brutal death bands is just continuous streams of 16th notes, or the way that like a band like Psychroptic just sounds like thrash. And, similarly, the modern beatdown stuff, well, that all has Slayer behind it, and I'll get to that in a sec, and then the old school death metal also all has Slayer behind it. So the interesting thing is, although this is influenced by beatdown, it's mostly in the vein of production, right? Really thick, crushing tone and willingness to get ignorant, right? It's culturally influenced by beatdown. But the rhythms and the note choice and the inflection in the tone are all in this Slayer core vein. Like, to me, this would sound more familiar to someone from the early 2000s than it might to someone now.
Exactly it would. So, one, just brief aside, production on this record is incredible. This is what a mainline death metal record should sound like. This is awesome.
I was going to say that, my one last note on the Galaxy brand is what the production does is it takes the size of the beatdown tone and then it crisps it in the way that Slayer had this fantastically crisp tone, or some of the Slayer core bands did. Or, like Catharsis in the more crusty side of things, a really crisp sort of searing tone. And so here you get So suddenly the music has more bite than, like obviously we fucking love Zabalba and we love shit like that, but in the wake of that, the music could sort of beatdown could get very flabby and sort of regress back to deathcore, like bong, 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 right? Or like the things that we don't like about nu metal. But so this is like you take that tone mass and you give it sharp edges, and it becomes really crisp and powerful and enjoyable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It sounds wonderful. It's a perfect, everybody knows me. I love brutal death and slam so much, but the tone, as far as mainline death metal, this is phenomenal recording and production. But kind of like bridging off of the Slayer idea, the idea of Slayer as a starting point for death metal, and also talking about the early and mid 2000s. Have you ever actually listened to... Because I think your thesis is basically correct, that this is an idea of, okay, what if death metal is about Slayer? But what's the immediate influence to a band like this? Well, have you ever listened to Skinless from New York?
No, I think... No, I have not. I think the name and the logo make them seem... I think they're too easily confused with that band Skindred.
My favorite reggae metal band. Okay, so Skinless, and this is what we're talking about. We're going back to the early mid 2000s. Skinless, you got into the stuff a little bit later than me, but right around, it was probably the tail end of when you got into things. Skinless was a household name. They were a just really well loved, like not the biggest, but like, the second string death metal band. They were wonderful. Incredible band. They're still around, still doing records, but they've never gotten back to the prominence they had in the 2000s. But listening to this record, I was like, holy shit, this might be a primary influence here, of all things. So let's listen to the title track off, I think it's their third record, Trample the Weak, Hurdle the Dead. Third or fourth record. And listen to a clip off this and tell me if you don't hear the similarity here.
We're not just going to shoot the bastard. We're going to cut out their living guts and use them to grease the treads of our tanks. We're going to murder those bastards by the bushel.
So yeah, you see there's a very similar energy going on with that band.
Yeah, I get exactly what you mean. If in some way, if anything, 200 Stab Wounds is a little more Slayery than this in some way, and that the Skinless seems to really like hanging out at mid tempo.
Yeah.
But what they do with those sort of lower mid tempo Slayery rhythms, absolutely the same kind of vocabulary. You could basically see this as like same structural ideas as some of those Slayer core bands, but just played with death metal inflections. Like and it's really good. The like they basically can just fit way more cool stuff in the same amount of time.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, so obviously they're coming from the New York death metal scene. New York death metal has always had hardcore in it, just formatively. But also, I think what we're seeing is a cool kind of trend as far as the age of these guys goes. Because I did a little bit of digging. It looks like these guys are in their, like, early to mid-20s. They're pretty young. But then let's look back. So nowadays, I was an early bloomer, but my age when I got into extreme metal, like 12 or 13, that's pretty common now. So let's say these guys are, 7 years younger than us, and then they're 12 or 13. Well, that puts them getting into this right in the mid to late 2000s. So it's very easy that maybe the first death metal record they heard, a formative influence, wouldn't necessarily be old school death metal. It would be like early to mid 2000s. It might be Skinless, Impaled, older aborted stuff that we take for granted now as just being like, oh, that's on Century Media, that's on Relapse, we don't care about that. But those are
1349.
Yeah. 1349 being like a formative influence for a black metal band, who are guys like 5 to 8 years younger than us. But something interesting that you also wrote was about the idea of like the interaction between hardcore and death metal. The idea of like, you described it as hardcore body snatching death metal. So do you want to talk about that for a moment before I get into my sample?
Yeah, well, I was just saying, like, I mean, you could take the Slayer thesis even further and just go, or the Slayer hypothesis, and you could say, like, something we say on the show sometimes is, wasn't Slayer just the most advanced hardcore band of the mid-'80s?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Most advanced D-beat-based hardcore band, something like that, right? Hardcore starting from D-beat and the Misfits, basically. And you could... there is really something to that, especially in the middle of Rain and Blood. And if those guys are on to that, consciously or unconsciously, then it's kind of like maybe they grew up listening to a lot of hardcore. They've found, or just listening to hardcore and death metal sort of alongside each other without almost a distinction. And they found there's this sort of prehistoric line where, like, death metal just is mutant hardcore. And where that's almost... I mean, we stress the influence of that stuff on death and black metal all the time. But, like, so if you take that idea to it, it's like, okay, if Slayer was kind of a hardcore band, then death metal, and death metal is Slayer, then death metal should be thrashing hardcore. And similarly then, it's like, that goes along with that sort of hardcore perspective history of death metal, sort of revisionist history, kind of goes along with what we've seen socially, right? Which is that, like, something like Maggot Stomp acts like a hardcore label. The people around it act like hardcore people. Many of them have short hair or have recently developed long hair. Some of them might sort of superficially display very theatrical versions of metal stuff, like crazy sunglasses, right? But they all sell gym shorts and shit. Even though the bands often sound like early '90s death metal in some ways, right? They're imitating Mortician or whatever, right?
Yeah.
The gestures are very hardcore, and many of these people are just like hardcore dudes who got into death metal, and so if you're saying this is the new default death metal sound, and it might be
that is my hot take, is that this is what death metal, mainline death metal, will sound like for the next 10 years.
And I think you would kind of say it should sound like that, right?
Oh dude, fuck yeah, absolutely, yeah. This is great.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is great too. So then the question is, does mainline death metal, aspiring in the classic way to maximalism, heaviosity, bang your head, stuff like that, if mainline kind of fun death metal is going to sound like this, is that now just hardcore? Has the hardcore scene just sort of, is that now an outgrowth of hardcore? And there are other kinds of death metal doing other things.
Well, here's kind of my response to that. God, the samples are assembled so wonderfully on this one. We got so lucky with the way these are laid out. Here's my response to that. We're going to go to the track Itty Bitty Pieces. We're going to listen to the first half of it. And now, especially after listening to that Skinless sample, that was a great example of mid-2000s mainline death metal, I want you to listen to this carefully and tell me which riffs from this are hardcore and which are death metal. Or, moreover, which could not be featured on either side of the genre equation. Ladies and gentlemen, my thesis is that any of those riffs could be on either a hardcore or a death metal record now. My other hot take, apart from this being the sound of death metal in the future, is death metal and hardcore are damn near the same thing now.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's got to be true. And maybe if the Slayer hypothesis is right, sort of always, to some degree, always kind of were. The weird thing is a lot of these riffs, a lot of these death metal, certainly they could be played by either band today, either genre today. A lot of them couldn't have been played by a hardcore band in the early 90s, but certainly some of them
by the time of
much more...
By the time of like Perseverance era Hatebreed, yeah.
Yeah, and some of it sounds like, or fucking, we love Shattered Realm, right? But,
yeah.
but like, some of the most Death Doom sounding ones, like at the beginning, right? Those riffs that sound kind of like it opened with like a Winter kind of riff, right? And Winter was one of those things that was rediscovered sometimes more by hardcore people, I think, via Coffins. Like, some of the opening of the track you could have heard being on sort of a Winter type record or Incantation type record in the early 90s, like one of those first riffs. And a lot of that stuff has just been completely incorporated into the post beatdown, post HM2 worship hardcore world, right?
Yeah. Well, I think you touch on
the only thing that sounds very now, like, yeah. So what's remarkable is A, it could be from either now. B, it doesn't sound very like. There's not much that makes it sound trendy. The only thing that marks it as a very now band is the sort of the mongoloid skank. Which is sort of that's the caveman shit trademark, basically, right? And if I'm not mistaken, that is something you would have been more likely to get on a gore grind record or something. Gets picked up by the hardcore scene and integrated with the sort of 1-2 slow skank stuff from lots of Stompy 2000s hardcore.
Yeah, I think
then becomes the caveman riff.
I think the specific origin of that stuff is like a semi-deep cut. It probably is nowadays from the slam death scene. A band called Short Bus Pile Up, who only did they only did one record. It was called Repulsive Display of Human Upholstery. It's a band with one record, but that record went off like a nuke in, the brutal death scene. And there's a lot of stuff on this record that I think comes directly from that record. And I think hardcore kids also listen to that record. That was a huge one. That's worthy of talking about more. But I think this also relates to the age of the guys in this band, the idea of this, like, agglutinative idea of death metal. Because imagine if you're just a little bit younger than us, then you grow up with brutal death and slam and kind of early deathcore stuff just in the background. That's just part of death metal to you. So something we haven't talked about, but is on basically all these samples, is there's full-fledged slams in this, but they glide by. You don't think of them as, like, big slam riffs in the way the slam
definitely had a slam, didn't it?
Oh yeah, there's huge slams across this record, but they don't present them the same way. But it shows you, okay, so brutal death and slam death, that's like background radiation, and that's just part of death metal for younger guys now, and that's awesome. That's the way you tie all these things together. I think we were talking at one point, I forget which band it was. It was like, how do you make slam or brutal death metal? Yeah, how do we bring that into mainline death metal? And this is the way you do it. You just fucking do it as a natural part of how you make your songs. It's, God, this is a fucking good record.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, I hear what you mean. They hid the slams under the Slayer riff, so I didn't even realize I was eating them.
Yes, yeah, it's like they put the vegetables under the meat for you.
Yeah, that's how you can get millennials to eat their slams. Maybe the whole reason that, like, old school rooted down mainline death metal has been so fucking boring is it's just the fault of people our age.
Yeah, possibly. I think that there's kids right now. I mean, this is the litmus test.
People our age are like 5 years older, because it was god-awful boring in 2010, too.
Yeah, it was. But now we've got kids in their, like, early to mid-20s who are just blowing shit up like this.
Are we finally past the Sweet Death glut? Did that
we
quietly... are. Because it was still going... It had sort of transferred over to the hardcore scene as this sort of, like, canned HM2 crap thing. That must still be around. But, like...
Oh, yeah, it's still around in metal, too, but, like... I mean, that's nostalgia bait for people our age and older now.
Has Maggot Stomp basically... Because that was, like, the going candidate for default fun, bang your head, meat and potatoes death metal for a long time, and it was not a very satisfying one. So is it that and it sort of... It astonished me how long that lasted. That it was revivalism from the beginning, and it had like a 15-year run, almost between 10 and 15 years of the same revivalist sound, and it seems to have quietly rolled over and whimpered and died.
The revival movement lasted longer than the gap between the origin and the revival movement.
That is absolutely true.
It's like 15 years later, people are like, oh, we're bringing back old school Sweet Death, and it's like, it just died like 3 years ago, the original thing.
Well, the best Sweet Death revival record was just written by the drummer of Entombed.
Yeah.
like nobody's beaten Death Breath to this day. He wrote that right. He wrote those records like 2008 or something, or 7. Anyway, so okay, that's a tangent.
All right, what do you got?
So I got another sample. And here, as far as the range of sounds on here, this is the title track, and here you get something that's closer to a pure modern beatdown moment.
Well, that one definitely justifies the whole, like, Slayer hypothesis.
Yeah, just when you're thinking, oh, this sounds more like a beatdown thing, right? They just, yeah. So, one thing this band does really well, one problem they solve, right? I mean, several things to say at once. I mean, first of all, I mean, it's hard to pick which is the sickest of those riffs.
Yeah.
Like, what's really cool is the way they're using that that sweep at the beginning.
Oh, dude, it's the only time sweeps have ever been cool.
Yes. Big chugga chugga riff, sweep punctuate. And that really relates to the skinless thing. Because it's like, what can you do? Okay, how do you use... What if death metal, instead of having this kind of like sort of territorial sort of hackles raised thing about brainless hardcore rhythms, what if death metal was like, oh, well, I mean, at its root, death metal's also supposed to be pretty brainless, and I mean, blast beats are brainless by definition, you know, like, like, what if we're just okay with hardcore rhythms? Instead of getting all up in arms about it. And with hardcore at its most, chugga chugga. If you embrace those basic rhythmic frames, then what death metal allows you to do is just, like, do way more shit in them than a hardcore band can do. So, the sweep pick, and then they lock it into just that sick, really, a consistent technique throughout this record is the up-tempo two-step. And they lock it in using the sweep riff. Just, that's crushing. And I'll say, like, there aren't many of the trademark caveman straight arm skank riffs on this record.
Yeah. Don't
need to be, because those excellent up-tempo two-steps do exactly the same thing better.
Yeah.
And then after that, they just light it up with the Slayer shit. So, I don't know.
The Slayer shit goes crazy. That's the most obvious Slayer moment. Are those back end riffs there? Holy fuck!
And when we faded the sample out too, it's like they just finished some Slayer riffs and they're starting some new Slayer riffs, right? And they're so good. They're like, I mean, Slayer stopped writing riffs that good pretty much right after Rain and Blood. Honestly, I mean, like,
yeah, it's amazing how it's like, but like I'd like to go back. It's like obviously Slayer riffs across this record that never feel like thrash. You know, it's fascinating, the reinterpretation.
They only pick up on the coolest parts of Slayer. Like, they only pick up on the death metal and hardcore aspects of Slayer riffs.
Yeah. Also, I appreciate you saying earlier that it's like Slayer is... This whole idea of the Big Four, Slayer's completely apart from all those other bands.
The Big Four, those other 3 bands suck, and Slayer rules.
Yes.
I mean, I'll pick 10 songs. I mean, Metallica made one important technological contribution, which was the sort of just extremely percussive root note chug. We have to thank them for that, and about 10 songs on the first 2 albums.
That's fair. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah. So like, in terms of, so yeah, this is sick. And another thing it does well. So another thing that a band like this can do. So if one thing it can do is do way more stuff in the rhythmic space provided by sort of the classic '90s metalcore format, it could also do things that the modern beatdown bands are very bad at, which is fast parts good. Right?
Yes, that's true.
The modern beatdown bands, like, there are occasionally bands that succeed at going only slow, and some bands realize that, okay, this is our strong suit, and then you get down-tempo, right?
Yeah.
But very often in these bands, the fast parts exist solely to set up mosh parts, and they're simply not very good. But, like, all the riffs should be good.
Well, I mean, this goes back to your idea. I forget which band we were covering on the show, but your thesis statement, which I've come to basically agree with, which is that death metal needs hardcore to create rhythmic developments, and hardcore needs death metal to develop riff ideas. You know? And I think this is the synthesis of those ideas right here. 200 Stab Wounds could play a hardcore show as easily as they could a death metal show.
Yeah, I mean, this is I see what you mean. Thanks for reminding me of that. I mean, we've talked about versions of that a few times in the show. Maybe I mentioned that in Hanging Fortress.
Oh, yeah, probably.
Hanging Fortress is a band that, although billed as death metal, basically works in hardcore rhythmic forms, right?
Yeah, they've got like a Bury Your Dead style hardcore track on their album we covered last year. So real quick, I'll get to my final sample. So, Drilling Your Head. We'll listen to the whole thing. It's a 2-minute song. So here's where we're going to show our age a little bit. A lot of kind of younger guys listen to our show, like mid-20s and younger, which doesn't seem like a big gap, but in terms of like a music scene, it actually is. So you're about to hear a bunch of very groovy, obviously hardcore-inspired riffs that I do remember from 2000s death metal, but we never thought of them as hardcore. We didn't have that vocabulary, because back then there was still a serious sort of animosity between metal and hardcore. Now everybody listens to everything. It's completely different. But the idea is these ideas have existed musically for 20 plus years now, but we have a different interpretation. Let's think about like a great example would be a band like Jungle Rot, who basically play like down-tuned Madball songs and turn them into death metal songs.
So, yeah, your old favorites, Jungle Rot. Yes.
Oh, Jungle Rot is so fucking good.
The death metal guy used to legitimately piss off other death metal fans by telling them he liked Jungle Rot.
Yes. And also, and here, adding to the idea of the synthesis, Jungle Rot, a band that had been on Century Media, was just a standby band, is on Victory Records now. So, it makes perfect sense.
I was the person you could talk about hardcore with. You came to me like, am I crazy? These hardcore bands, they sound good. And I'm like, you're not crazy, death metal guy.
Exactly. So, well, let's listen to Drilling Your Head, and yeah, here we go. Jungle Rot in 2021. Let's go. Dude, holy fuck.